Well, morning everyone. I'm going to pray as we begin, and I'm going to use some ancient words written nearly 500 years ago to help us focus our minds on this great psalm that we're coming together to look at in a moment. Let's pray together, shall we? O Lord, you are more ready to hear than I am to pray, and you're inclined to give me more than I desire or deserve. Because I have taken refuge in Jesus' saving work on my behalf, give me the protection and joy for which it would be presumptuous otherwise to ask. Amen. Well, again, morning, everyone. How are you doing this morning? I mean, how are you really doing this morning? This week has seen that unwanted milestone of 100 days in lockdown for those of us living here in the UK. And although there are some glimmers of light just at the end of the tunnel beginning to perhaps get a bit brighter and a bit closer as lockdown starts to ease for many of us, it has been and continues to be a tough time, isn't it? Can I level with you? I mean, we're all friends here, right? I've found the last couple of weeks particularly just tough going. I think it's cumulative. I think it's just getting worn down by what's going on. No particular reason. I mean, I've got much to be thankful for. Roof over my head, food on the table, a garden to sit in and potter about in when it's sunny, wonderful countryside just kind of at the end of the road where we can go walking or running if we want some fresh air. Family in good health, friends locally and further afield in good health, watching out for one another. But there's something about a global pandemic which is unsettling. Emotions change so quickly, don't they? You perhaps feel fine when you wake up, but then by lunchtime you're feeling saddened. You perhaps remembered all the things that you'd hoped to do and were looking forward to do, which have been cancelled. Perhaps you're bothered about some news headline about a second wave or the vaccine and how long that's going to take, and so your emotions take a bit of a tumble. Perhaps there's some personal experience that's happened in the last week that has caused deep questions in your own heart and your own mind. Or is that just me? I doubt it somehow. We've all had to cope, haven't we, with those very real but very different worries and fears and concerns. It's been said more than once, hasn't it, that we're not all in the same boat, but we're all in the same stall. So let me ask you a question. How are you doing? What are your fears? What are you afraid of this morning? Because these last 100 days, in a very real sense, have been a sort of microcosm of life in general. I grant you they've been much more intense and focused and compressed and concentrated, but life itself doesn't remain on an even keel for very long, does it? You think you've just got it worked out, just about got it worked out, and then the goalposts move. And things change and things shift. Situations change, relationships change, people change. We use the expression, things like, it's a roller coaster of emotions for good reason, because it is just that, isn't it? You experience the highs and the lows, and they just keep rolling over us and keep washing over us in waves. And you can experience those highs and those lows almost with consecutive breaths some days. Life's never straightforward for very long. Things are always complicated. So what is it you're afraid of? If you read the surveys of what people in the UK are afraid of, the usual suspects come close to the top 10. There's things like being afraid of needles. Not so keen on those myself, to be honest. Dentists is another big one up there. Being afraid of heights. It's not so much the heights that bother me, it's the falling and the sudden stop at the bottom. But public speaking is another one, where people have that fear of standing up in front of a crowd of people and opening their mouth and then nothing. Spiders, blood, crowds, flying. They're all real fears for many people. But there are bigger fears, aren't there? Deeper fears. Fears around the future. Fears around rejection. Fears around death, ultimately. And I think that's what's going through the mind of this writer to this psalm, Psalm 71, that we read together a few minutes ago in its entirety. We don't know who they were. Probably King David, but we're not sure of that. There's no title to the psalm. He borrows language from King David if it's not him himself. The opening of Psalm 71 is almost identical to the opening of Psalm 31, which we do know was written by David. Whoever it was that wrote it, they're an older person now. They're more mature in years, and they're beginning to contemplate the end of life. We're going to be looking at the psalm in 4 sections through July Sunday mornings together. But today we're going to be particularly focusing on verses 1 to 4. But before we get there, just look down with me and you'll see what I mean. Verse 9, the writer says, "Don't cast me away when I'm old. Don't forsake me when my strength is gone." Fears for the future, fears around death, fears around rejection. Verse 18, similarly, "Even when I am old and grey, do not forsake me, O God." There are worries, very real worries that the writer is experiencing and feels. Rejection. When someone finds out what I'm really like, will they ultimately forsake me? Those friends that I think I've got, when they know a little bit more about me, when they really get to know me, will they still want to be my friends? The future. I'm not in control. We all live with those sort of what ifs, those big questions, don't we? They keep rolling over us. I can't face the future. I can't control the future. I don't know what the future holds. Will I make it? Will I still be trusting Jesus at the end of it? Will he let me go ultimately? Big worries, big fears, and fears around death too. I don't know how old you have to be really before you start contemplating this one in any more detail, but for all of us, we've been presented with the facts around death daily as we've watched those Downing Street briefings until they finished a short time ago, and those horrific numbers of people dying day after day after day. And thankfully, we're told we're back down to normal now, whatever normal is. I mean, is death normal? Is it ever normal? Is it ever just natural? You'll have been, like me, to funerals where almost it feels like the person leading it doesn't know what to say. You know, they talk about the person just moving into a next door room or just becoming another star in the sky, and you think, really? Is that the best we can do? Doesn't cut it, does it? I mean, death, we know, when we lay a loved one to rest, it's a curse. It's traumatic. Even for a Christian believer whose hope is secure, it's a very dark door they have to pass through before they enter the light. And I think that's particularly partly the focus here as the psalmist contemplates later life. Gordon MacDonald is an older pastor and author from the States, and he's written and spoken very movingly about what it means to grow old, particularly in a church context, and the fears, the emotions that come with that. Asked how it feels to grow old within the church, he says the overriding emotion is one of fear. And these are his words now. "How am I going to die? Will anybody be there when I do? Will I die a long death or a slow death? Will I get Alzheimer's? Will I get dementia? Will I peacefully go in my sleep? Or so people live with fear," he says. "And they live with bitterness. My grandchildren seldom come home. My son only wants my money. My friends are all dying. There's no one left." And they live with anger. The system letting them down. "I thought it would be different." You have people in the church, he says, in their 70s, 75, 80, 85, who for 25, 35, 45 years have given everything to the life of that church. They sat on the committees. You know, in our context, they would have run the teams. They would have led the home groups. They would have served in so many different ways. They were there week in, week out, putting the chairs out, putting the Bibles away, serving the youth and the kids, giving you a cup of coffee. But now nobody even knows they're there. Nobody knows their name. And they become bitter. Is this all we get after all those years of serving and faithfulness in the church? Real fears, you see, of rejection, of the future, and of death. I think as you start to think about these things, ultimately, they're all fears of failure. They stem from where we've put our trust. We all have these little life rafts, things that we cling to ensure that we don't sink in life. It might be your long service. It might be your proving your value in your career, your workplace. It might be your own wisdom, being able to back yourself, to figure stuff out and work out any situation. It might be your financial resources that will enable you to weather any storm. What's the life raft look like for you? But when those things get threatened, when we get pushed outside of our comfort zone in any one of those areas, we begin to fear that we'll look stupid, that we'll appear a failure, and that we might have been found trusting in the wrong thing. And if you peel away the layers of that, I think underneath that is a mistrust ultimately of what God has said, of who he is and what he said to us. The fear is, what if I have pinned everything on him and he lets me down? And it's the oldest line in the book, by the way. If you turn back to the beginning of the story in Genesis chapter 3, as Adam and Eve are given this beautiful world to inhabit and care for and look after, the snake in chapter 3, more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made, says to the woman, the evil one, the devil, comes to them and says, did God really say? He undermines what God has said and God's word. And so hence the prayer, I think, in Psalm 71 verse 1, in you, Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. As I approach the end of my life, Lord, don't let me down. Don't let me down now. Let me never be put to shame. Don't let my trust in you ultimately prove to be misplaced. My life, my future, my eternity hangs on what you have promised and on my decision to trust you. Others might think I'm crazy trusting you. I mean, that's what he goes on to say in verse 10. My enemies speak against me. Those who wait to kill me conspire together. They say, God has forsaken him. Pursue him. Seize him. No one will rescue him. There seems to be a gap between what we believe and what we experience. Please, God, don't let me down. So the next question then really is, where do you turn when those fears threaten to overwhelm you? Where do you go? We've all had to learn to adjust our behaviour in recent weeks, haven't we? We've had to stay at home, save lives and protect the NHS. Perhaps it was a different order. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. That mantra that was drummed into us. But we had to stay at home, shelter within these four walls to prevent the spread of the virus, to protect ourselves and others. I acknowledge for many, home wasn't the place of security and safety it should have been. But that's the idea, isn't it? That you stay at home as your refuge. In the US, they have them slightly more snappily titled shelter-in-place orders that they've issued. Shelter-in-place is adapting an existing rule that says when there's a terrorist attack or a natural disaster, you shelter in place. You don't try and run, you don't try and evacuate to somewhere else, you shelter where you are. But the writer of this psalm isn't advocating that you shelter in place. He's saying go somewhere else. He's keen to go somewhere. He's keen to go somewhere which is always open, which is always available to him, which is completely secure, solid, a real place of safety. In you, Lord, I have taken refuge. And in verse 3, he prays this, be my rock of refuge to which I can always go. Give the command, or you have given the command to save me, for you are my rock and my fortress. When the fears of life and the storms threaten to overwhelm you, where do you go? Do you go to your wisdom? The fact that you've been able to figure it out? What happens when you can't? What happens when the problem becomes too big for you to figure out? What happens when somebody cleverer than you comes along and you realise the limitations of your own wisdom? What about your financial resources? Tragically, COVID-19 has put paid to that for many of us. And just proving your value in the workplace, putting in more hours and climbing the ladder there. Again, tragically, how has that worked out for tens of thousands of individuals in the past week through no fault of their own? No, rather than saying, did God really say, we say, God really said. We take God at his word. There is a place of safety and a place of security from the greatest fears that you can ever face, which is always available and is completely dependable. The psalmist had found it, and I pray and trust that you will too. You see, we're still in the storm, but we're sheltered from it. It's only in him that you'll ever find real security and those deepest fears that you face answered. Our trust in him can never be misplaced. And here's why. Because in verse 2, the writer appeals to something about God. He says, in your righteousness, rescue me and deliver me. Turn your ear to me and save me. We appeal to something about God, his character, his nature. We appeal to his faithfulness. You see, he is righteous. He is always going to do the right thing, the just thing, the fair thing. He will always keep his promise. He will always keep his word. He cannot break that. It's his nature, his character. And so we need to deliberately cultivate the habit day after day of coming to him and finding that security in him. It's not just a one-off thing, you see, it's a perpetual thing. I always go. And there's something deeper going on. How can we possibly appeal to God's righteousness? Think about it for a moment. If God is just and right and fair, and I know anything about the sin of my own heart, I know that appealing to his righteousness could be a potentially fatal, lethal thing. There's no way that we could approach him. Psalm 130, another writer, as we get towards the end of the book of Psalms, says this: if you, Lord, kept a record of sins, Lord, who could stand? The storm of his righteousness would be far worse than anything we would face. And yet, that's our appeal. Well, it's our appeal more clearly for us than perhaps it was even for the writer of this psalm, because we look back to the place where God's wrath and righteous anger and justice and his love and his mercy meet at the cross, the ultimate act of God's righteousness. We look back to Jesus himself being placed into the hands of the wicked, like the words of verse 4, and the grasp of those who are evil and cruel, and being put to death on the cross. In fact, it's worse than that, isn't it? Because the hands of those who are wicked, the grasp of those who are evil and cruel is me. It's my mistrust. It's my not taking God at his word. It's my thinking I know better that's placed Jesus on the cross, and my hands have held him down and nailed him to it. And he takes on himself there anything that would cause me shame, anything that would cause God to send me away, anything that would prevent me returning to God is taken on Jesus' shoulders for me. And he proves God's commitment to me. Having given us his only son, do you think he'll withhold any other good gift from us? So that place of safety, you see, is ultimately guaranteed. And the confidence the writer displays in the rest of the psalm that we're going to look at in the next 3 weeks can be yours this morning too. So how will you respond? How do you find this refuge for yourself? Well, 2 things, very simply, to think about as we close. 2 things. You stop looking elsewhere for refuge. You stop looking to those other life rafts that I mentioned a minute or 2 ago, whatever it is for you. You stop going there for refuge. I mean, ultimately, they're like children's armbands in the teeth of a hurricane. They're going to be no good to you at all. And you cry out to God. Ask God to do for you what this writer did. In your righteousness, rescue me and deliver me. Turn your ear to me and save me. That's all you have to do. You don't have to generate this kind of courage and this kind of faith from within. It is a gift from God himself. Even this is a gift from God to you. And if you do that this morning, I guarantee to you that you will make it. In fact, I don't, God does. God guarantees. The storms will keep coming, but a life lived in that dependence upon him, as described in this psalm, means that our fears, although real, will ultimately be unfounded. Because of this, verse 14, we always have a hope. We always have a hope. Verse 15, we'll always have a story. We'll have those righteous deeds, those saving acts that we'll be able to tell him of. That perspective that one day we'll look back and see how God was with us in the storm. Verse 20, we'll always have a future. Though we see many troubles, many and bitter, you will restore my life again. We have a future. And hard as it is to see during lockdown, we have a song. My lips, in verse 23, shall shout for joy when I sing praise to you, I whom you have delivered. He's looking forward to that day. And so can we. Don't face the storms alone this morning. Don't put your trust in something that ultimately will prove to be futile and misplaced. Come to this God, this rock of refuge, the rock, the fortress. Find refuge in him. Let me pray those words again that we started with, and I hope they'll have deeper meaning for us, having thought about the words from that psalm together. Let's pray again. O Lord, you are more ready to hear than I am to pray, and you are inclined to give me more than I desire or deserve. Because I have taken refuge in Jesus' saving work on my behalf, give me the protection and joy for which it would be presumptuous otherwise to ask. Amen.